Something unexplainable happened when the billionaire came near the janitor's baby. The mahogany doors of the Beverly Hills mansion closed with the weight of finality behind the last departing executive. Alexander Morrison stood alone in his study, the echo of polite laughter and strategic conversations still hanging in the air like expensive cologne. At 58, he had mastered the art of commanding rooms filled with ambitious minds and billion-dollar decisions. Yet tonight felt different, hollow in ways he couldn't articulate. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled beneath him like a constellation of possibilities he had long since conquered. His reflection stared back from the darkened glass. Sharp suit, silver-streaked temples, eyes that had seen too many boardroom victories and not enough moments that mattered. The quarterly reports scattered across his desk told stories of unprecedented growth, but they felt as distant as obituaries for someone else's life. A sound pierced the silence, soft, rhythmic, unmistakably human. Alexander paused, his hand frozen above the whiskey decanter. The sound came again, footsteps in the hallway accompanied by a gentle murmuring in accented English and what seemed like crying. A baby's crying. He had forgotten about the staff still working. Maria, the new housekeeper from Brazil, had mentioned something about needing to bring her infant daughter to work occasionally. Emergency childcare, she had explained, with the careful politeness of someone who expected rejection. Alexander had barely registered the request, offering a distracted nod while reviewing acquisition proposals. Now, curiosity pulled him from his study toward the source of the commotion. He found himself walking through corridors that suddenly felt too large, his footsteps muffled by Persian rugs that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The crying grew louder, more desperate, and with it came an unexpected sensation in his chest, not irritation, as he might have expected, but something raw, discomfort, the kind that made him question why he was moving toward the sound instead of retreating to his private quarters. In the main living room, he discovered Maria kneeling beside a portable carrier, her voice a gentle stream of Portuguese mixed with English as she tried to soothe a red-faced infant. The woman looked up with startled eyes when she noticed him in the doorway, immediately standing and smoothing her uniform with nervous efficiency. "Mr. Morrison, I'm so sorry. I know you have guests leaving and I tried to keep her quiet, but she won't—" Alexander raised a hand to silence the apology. His attention had shifted entirely to the baby, whose crying had indeed crescendoed to an almost operatic level of distress. The child's tiny fists were clenched, her face scrunched in what appeared to be existential fury at the world she had so recently entered. Without conscious thought, Alexander stepped closer. The crying stopped, not gradually, not with the gentle winding down one might expect, but with the abrupt completeness of a record needle lifted mid-song. The baby's eyes, impossibly large and dark, fixed on his face with startling directness. Then, as if responding to some private joke only she understood, the infant broke into delighted laughter. The sound was pure, untainted by the calculated pleasantries he encountered daily. It bubbled up from some deep well of joy that Alexander had forgotten existed in the world. More unsettling than the laughter itself was his response to it, a tightening in his throat, a strange pressure behind his eyes, and the uncomfortable realization that he had moved even closer to the carrier without deciding to do so. Maria watched this exchange with an expression Alexander couldn't decode, part relief, part bewilderment, and something else. Wariness, perhaps. The room felt suspended, as if the very air had thickened around this improbable moment. Alexander found himself studying the child's features with forensic intensity, searching for something he couldn't name. The baby reached toward him with uncoordinated movements, her small hand opening and closing as if trying to grasp something just beyond reach. He didn't extend his finger for her to hold. He didn't speak in the sing-song voice adults reflexively adopted around children. Instead, he remained motionless, studying this tiny person who had accomplished something no boardroom adversary or business rival had managed in decades. She had rendered him completely speechless. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11 times, each note emphasizing the lateness of the hour and the peculiarity of the scene. Alexander realized he should return to his study, should allow Maria to finish her work and take her daughter home. Instead, he heard himself asking, "What's her name?" "Sophia," Maria answered quietly, her voice carrying notes of both pride and protectiveness. "She's 6 months old." Alexander nodded, though the information felt insufficient to explain the strange gravity he felt in the child's presence. Sophia continued to gurgle contentedly, her earlier distress completely forgotten, as if his proximity had solved whatever cosmic problem had been troubling her small world. He remained there longer than propriety suggested, longer than logic demanded, watching a baby who seemed to see something in him that he had lost track of long ago. 3 weeks passed before Alexander admitted to himself that his behavior had changed. The admission came during his morning routine, as he found himself pausing at the top of the grand staircase to listen for sounds from the lower floors. Not the familiar hum of household machinery or the quiet efficiency of his regular staff, but something more specific. Something that made him feel both foolish and oddly anticipatory. Maria arrived each Tuesday and Friday at 7 in the morning, her daughter secured in a car seat that looked incongruous against the marble and crystal of his foyer. Alexander had begun timing his own movements through the house to coincide with these arrivals, though he told himself it was merely coincidental. A man needed his coffee at a reasonable hour. The fact that he now took this coffee in the breakfast nook overlooking the service entrance was simply a matter of changing preferences. His assistant, David Chen, had noticed. David noticed everything. It was what made him invaluable and occasionally insufferable. This morning, David stood in the doorway of the breakfast nook with the expression of someone who had discovered his employer reading children's books or collecting stamps. "The Henderson acquisition requires your signature," David said, placing a leather portfolio beside Alexander's untouched newspaper. His tone carried the careful neutrality of someone choosing words with surgical precision. "Also, Mrs. Garrett called regarding the charity gala next month. She needs final approval on the guest list." Alexander nodded absently, his attention caught by movement in the garden below. Maria was lifting Sophia from the car seat, the baby wrapped in what appeared to be a hand-knitted yellow blanket. Even from this distance he could see the child's animated gestures, her small arms reaching toward something beyond his field of vision. "Sir?" David's voice carried a sharper edge. Alexander forced his attention back to the documents. The Henderson deal represented 18 months of negotiation, the acquisition of a tech startup with revolutionary applications in sustainable energy. It should have commanded his complete focus. Instead, he found himself skimming paragraphs while straining to hear the sounds of Maria settling Sophia in the service quarters. "Schedule a call with Henderson for this afternoon," Alexander said, signing without his usual meticulous review. "And tell Mrs. Garrett I'll approve whatever guest list she prefers." David's eyebrows rose incrementally. Alexander Morrison did not delegate social decisions to others, particularly not events that served as networking opportunities disguised as philanthropy. David had witnessed his employer spend 45 minutes debating seating arrangements for previous galas, treating each placement like a chess move with financial implications. "Of course, sir. Will there be anything else?" Alexander was about to dismiss him when a sound drifted up from below, not crying this time, but delighted squealing. The kind of sound that suggested Sophia had discovered something endlessly entertaining. Despite himself, Alexander found his mouth curving upward in response. "Actually," he said, standing abruptly, "I need to inspect the service areas today. Ensure everything is maintained to proper standards." The lie felt transparent even as he spoke it. Alexander Morrison had never inspected service areas. He employed people specifically to ensure such inspections were unnecessary, yet he found himself walking toward the kitchen with purposeful strides, leaving David staring after him with undisguised concern. The kitchen staff had learned to work around Sophia's presence with remarkable adaptability. The baby now occupied a corner spot near the window, surrounded by an improvised play area consisting of clean kitchen towels and wooden spoons that doubled as toys. Maria worked efficiently at the far end, polishing silver with the focused intensity of someone who understood that excellence was expected, not requested. Sophia spotted Alexander the moment he entered and immediately began what could only be described as a full-body celebration. Her legs kicked with enthusiasm, her arms windmilled, and she produced a series of sounds that seemed designed specifically to capture his attention. The effect was both gratifying and deeply unsettling. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," Maria said, quickly setting down her polishing cloth. "I hope Sophia isn't disturbing—" "She's not disturbing anything," Alexander interrupted, then felt compelled to explain his presence. "I wanted to ensure the silverware cleaning met standards." "Important dinner next week," Maria nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. She returned to her work while Alexander found himself drawn inexorably towards Sophia's makeshift play area. The baby watched his approach with apparent delight, as if he were the most fascinating thing she had encountered in her brief existence. "She seems very alert," Alexander observed, crouching beside the blanket. Up close, he could see that Sophia's dark eyes held an unusual intensity for an infant. She studied his face with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, reaching toward him with determined persistence. "She is very smart," Maria agreed, pride evident in her voice, always watching, always learning. "Sometimes I think she understands more than babies should." Sophia's reaching intensified, accompanied by increasingly insistent vocalizations. Without thinking, Alexander extended his index finger. Tiny fingers immediately wrapped around it with surprising strength, and Sophia's delighted gurgling filled the kitchen. The sensation was unlike anything in his considerable experience. Purely physical, yet somehow deeply emotional, connecting him to this small person in ways that bypassed rational thought entirely. "She likes you," Maria observed softly. "This is unusual for her. Usually she is very careful with strangers." Alexander found this information more significant than perhaps he should have. He remained crouched beside Sophia for several minutes, allowing her to explore his finger while she chattered in her private language. The kitchen staff continued their work around them, but he sensed their awareness, their careful avoidance of direct observation. When he finally stood, his knee joints protested the unaccustomed position. Sophia immediately began fussing, reaching toward him with obvious disappointment at his departure. The sound tugged at something in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years, the weight of being needed, of mattering to someone in an immediate, uncomplicated way. "I should return to my office," he announced to no one in particular, but he remained standing there, watching Sophia's increasingly distressed attempts to recapture his attention. Maria had paused in her work, studying his face with an expression he couldn't interpret. Finally, he forced himself to leave, walking through the corridors with measured steps while Sophia's disappointed cries echoed behind him. In his study, he sat behind his mahogany desk and stared at the Henderson acquisition papers, but the words seemed to float above the page like meaningless symbols. For the first time in decades, Alexander Morrison found himself wondering what it might feel like to be essential to someone's happiness, rather than simply useful for their ambitions. The coffee maker in Alexander's private study had remained unused for 6 months prior to Maria's employment. Now it brewed fresh coffee twice weekly, filling the room with an aroma that reminded him of hotel lobbies in São Paulo during business trips he had taken years ago. He told himself the coincidence was irrelevant, but each Tuesday and Friday morning found him in the kitchen, ostensibly reviewing morning reports while Maria prepared her own coffee with beans she brought from home. "Brazilian coffee is different," she had explained during one of these encounters, her English careful but confident. "The soil, the climate, it changes everything." "Would you like to try?" Alexander had accepted the offer with the gravity of someone agreeing to a significant business proposal. The coffee was indeed different, richer, with undertones he couldn't identify but found unexpectedly comforting. More disturbing was the realization that he had begun looking forward to these brief conversations, these moments of connection that felt entirely separate from the careful choreography of his professional interactions. Sophia, meanwhile, had established her own routines within his household. She napped in a portable crib near whatever room Maria was cleaning, awakening with the precision of an internal alarm whenever Alexander appeared. Her delight at seeing him had become so consistent that even the kitchen staff anticipated it, clearing pathways and adjusting their work to accommodate what had become an unspoken ritual. This morning, however, something felt different. Maria moved through her tasks with unusual efficiency, her conversation limited to polite responses when directly addressed. Sophia, sensing her mother's tension, had been fussy since arrival, crying with the kind of persistence that suggested deeper distress than simple hunger or sleepiness. Alexander found them in the main library, where Maria was dusting shelves with mechanical precision, while Sophia lay in her carrier, red-faced with frustrated tears. The usual magic of his presence failed to work. Sophia continued crying even when he approached, her small body rigid with distress. "Is she ill?" Alexander asked, surprised by the concern in his own voice. Maria paused in her dusting, cloth still in hand. "No, sir. She is, picking up on my mood. Babies feel everything their mothers feel." The admission hung in the air between them. Alexander found himself wanting to ask what was troubling her, then caught himself. He was her employer, not her confidant. The boundaries of their relationship had been clearly established, even if recent weeks had made those boundaries feel increasingly artificial. Sophia's crying intensified, and without thinking, Alexander reached down to lift her from the carrier. The action surprised them both. Maria turned with wide eyes, while Alexander found himself holding a 6-month-old baby for the first time in his adult life. Sophia's weight was negligible, but her presence felt enormous, her small body warm and solid against his chest. The crying stopped immediately. Sophia nestled against him with the trusting abandon that only infants possessed, her small hand fisting in his shirt fabric. The sensation was overwhelming, protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed, flooding his system like adrenaline before an important negotiation. "She trusts you," Maria observed softly, something in her voice that sounded like sadness. Alexander looked down at Sophia, who had begun making contented sounds against his shoulder. Her hair smelled faintly of lavender, baby shampoo, he supposed, though the scent triggered something deeper, some half-remembered association that remained frustratingly out of reach. "Maria," he said carefully, still holding Sophia, "if something is troubling you, perhaps I can help." The offer surprised him, even as he made it. Alexander Morrison did not involve himself in his employees' personal problems. He paid generous salaries precisely to avoid such complications. Yet something about Maria's obvious distress, combined with Sophia's earlier upset, had triggered responses he didn't fully understand. Maria's smile was brief and didn't reach her eyes. "You are very kind, Mr. Morrison, but some problems, they cannot be solved with money or influence." The statement felt like a gentle rebuke, though Alexander sensed no malice in it. Rather, it seemed like the observation of someone who had learned difficult truths about the limitations of power and wealth. He found himself wanting to press further, to understand what shadows were troubling this woman, whose daughter had somehow become the brightest part of his weekly routine. Sophia had fallen asleep against his shoulder, her breathing deep and even. Alexander remained perfectly still, unwilling to disturb her peace. The library felt transformed with this small person in his arms, less like a showcase of intellectual achievement and more like a place where real life might actually occur. "My mother used to say," Maria continued quietly, returning to her dusting, "that some people are born with old souls. They recognize each other across time and distance." She paused, glancing at Sophia sleeping in Alexander's arms. "Sophia has been drawn to you since the first day. This is not common for her." Alexander processed this information with the analytical mind that had built his fortune, but found no logical framework to contain it. Sophia's immediate connection to him remained inexplicable, yet undeniable. More troubling was his own response, the way his entire week seemed to organize itself around these brief interactions, the way her laughter could improve his mood in ways that closing million-dollar deals no longer managed. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "some connections transcend explanation." Maria looked at him then with an expression he couldn't decode, part gratitude, part sorrow, and something else that might have been recognition. "Perhaps they do," she agreed. Sophia stirred in his arms, making small sounds of contentment without fully awakening. Alexander found himself swaying slightly, some instinct he didn't know he possessed, attempting to maintain her peaceful state. The motion felt natural, as if he had been holding sleeping babies his entire life, rather than experiencing it for the first time at 58. When Maria finished the library and prepared to move to the next room, Alexander found himself reluctant to return Sophia to her carrier. The baby seemed equally content to remain where she was, her small hand still tangled in his shirt. The moment stretched between them, employer and employee, man and child, two people whose lives had intersected in ways neither could have anticipated. Finally, practical necessity won. Sophia was transferred back to her carrier with minimal fuss, though she immediately began searching for Alexander with disappointed sounds. He remained with them longer than usual, inventing reasons to review book arrangements while Maria worked. By the time they moved on, Alexander had made a decision that would have surprised his business associates. He instructed his assistant to clear his afternoon schedule. Some things, he realized, were more important than quarterly projections. The emergency call came on a Thursday morning at 6:15, 45 minutes before Maria's scheduled arrival. Alexander had been reviewing quarterly projections in his study when David's voice crackled through the intercom with uncharacteristic urgency. "Sir, I have Maria Santos on the line. She says it's about Sophia." The papers scattered across Alexander's desk suddenly felt irrelevant. He reached for the phone with a speed that surprised him, his heart rate accelerating in ways usually reserved for hostile takeover attempts. "Maria? What's happened?" Her voice came through strained and tired. "Mr. Morrison, I'm so sorry to call, but Sophia, she has fever since last night, very high. I am at the emergency room, but I cannot leave her to come to work. I know this creates problems." "Don't apologize," Alexander interrupted, already standing. "Which hospital?" "Cedars Sinai, but sir, you don't need to." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He ended the call before Maria could protest, grabbing his keys with movements that felt both impulsive and inevitable. David appeared in the doorway as Alexander strode toward the elevator, his expression a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Sir, you have the Morrison Foundation board meeting at 8, and the Henderson team arrives at 10 for final negotiations." "Cancel everything," Alexander said without breaking stride. "Reschedule for tomorrow or next week, whatever works." David's mouth opened, then closed. In 15 years of employment, he had never seen his employer cancel important meetings for personal reasons. The Morrison Foundation meeting had been scheduled for months, and the Henderson deal represented the culmination of extensive negotiations. "Should I provide a reason for the postponements?" Alexander paused at the elevator doors. The question seemed to require an answer he didn't possess. How could he explain that a 6-month-old baby's fever had suddenly become more urgent than multi-million-dollar business decisions? How could he articulate the anxiety clawing at his chest at the thought of Sophia in distress? "Tell them something unexpected came up," he said finally. "Family emergency." The lie felt both accurate and completely inadequate. 22 minutes later, Alexander found himself in a pediatric emergency waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and barely contained panic. The fluorescent lighting felt harsh against his eyes, and the plastic chairs seemed designed to maximize discomfort. He had never spent time in hospital waiting areas. His wealth and connections had always ensured private rooms and immediate access to specialists. Maria sat in a corner chair, Sophia sleeping fitfully against her shoulder. Even from across the room, Alexander could see the baby's flushed cheeks and hear her labored breathing. Maria looked up as he approached, her eyes widening with surprise and something that might have been relief. "Mr. Morrison, you didn't need to come. I know you have important work. How is she?" Alexander asked, settling into the chair beside her, despite its obvious inadequacy for a man of his stature. Up close, Sophia's condition looked even more concerning. Her usual animated expressions had been replaced by the slack vulnerability of illness, her small body radiating heat even through the light blanket wrapped around her. "Fever of 103, Maria explained quietly. "They say it could be just a virus, but in babies this young—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Alexander found himself studying Sophia's face with forensic intensity, as if his observation alone could will her back to health. The baby who had brought such unexpected joy to his regimented life now looked fragile and small, her usual bright awareness dimmed by illness. The sight triggered protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed. "What have the doctors said exactly?" he asked. "We wait. They run tests. In babies so young, fever can be dangerous quickly." Maria's English became more accented under stress, her carefully maintained composure showing cracks. "I am scared," she admitted quietly. The admission hung between them. Alexander realized this was the first time Maria had revealed genuine vulnerability in his presence. Her usual polite professionalism had been stripped away by maternal fear, leaving behind someone young and frightened and utterly human. "She's going to be fine," Alexander said with more conviction than he felt. "Cedars-Sinai has excellent pediatric specialists. They'll figure out what's wrong." Maria nodded, though her expression remained troubled. They sat in companionable silence, taking turns watching Sophia sleep and observing the controlled chaos of emergency room activity around them. Alexander noticed how Maria's hand never stopped moving in gentle circles across Sophia's back, an unconscious soothing gesture that seemed to ease the baby's restless movements. "Mr. Morrison," Maria said after nearly an hour of waiting, "you should go. Your work is important, and this could take many hours." The suggestion should have made sense. Alexander had obligations, responsibilities that affected hundreds of employees and millions in revenue. Yet the thought of leaving felt impossible, like abandoning something precious and irreplaceable. "I'll stay," he said simply. Maria looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. "Why?" she asked softly. The question deserved an honest answer, but Alexander found himself struggling to articulate something he didn't fully understand. Sophia had somehow become important to him in ways that defied logical explanation. Her laughter brightened his days. Her presence made his vast mansion feel less empty, and the thought of her suffering triggered responses that bypassed rational thought entirely. "Because," he said finally, "someone should be here who cares about her." Maria's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "You barely know her." "I know enough," Alexander replied, and realized as he said it that this was completely true. He knew Sophia's laugh could transform his entire mood. He knew she reached for him with trust and delight. He knew that holding her felt like holding something precious and irreplaceable. These facts seem more significant than months of careful analysis and strategic planning. When Sophia stirred and opened fevered eyes, she immediately sought Alexander's face. Even in illness, her recognition was instant and complete. She made small sounds of discomfort, reaching toward him with the persistence that had become their established pattern. Without hesitation, Alexander carefully lifted her from Maria's arms. Sophia settled against his chest with obvious relief, her labored breathing evening slightly. The nurses who passed their corner began to notice the well-dressed man holding a sick baby, with the careful intensity of someone who had discovered an unexpected calling. "She knows you," one elderly nurse observed during a routine check. "Babies don't usually settle like that with strangers." Alexander found himself reluctant to correct her assumption about his relationship to Sophia. The truth felt too complex for casual conversation, and something about being seen as Sophia's protector felt more right than anything in his carefully orchestrated professional life. Hours passed. Tests were run. Sophia's fever broke near midnight, and her usual alertness began to return gradually. When she finally smiled, weak but unmistakably delighted, at seeing Alexander's face, he felt something shift permanently inside his chest. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Maria turned to him with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with something that looked like resignation. "Thank you," she said simply, "for staying, for caring." "Sophia is lucky to have you in her life." Alexander realized, as they walked toward the hospital exit, that he was the lucky one. The morning routine had evolved without conscious decision. By the second week after Sophia's hospital stay, Alexander found himself timing his breakfast to coincide with Maria's arrival, then extending the meal well past his usual efficiency. The kitchen staff had adapted with the seamless professionalism that expensive households cultivated, ensuring fresh fruit was always available for Sophia, and that her portable high chair was positioned where Alexander could observe her animated attempts to feed herself. Sophia had recovered completely from her fever, but something fundamental had shifted in the household dynamic. Where before Alexander had made excuses to encounter them, now Maria seemed to expect his presence. She no longer startled when he appeared, no longer offered unnecessary apologies for Sophia's sounds or needs. The change felt natural, like settling into a rhythm that had always been waiting to be discovered. This Tuesday morning, Alexander sat across from Sophia as she destroyed a small piece of banana with the focused concentration of a master chef. Her technique involved more smearing than eating, but her obvious delight in the process was infectious. Each successful bite was celebrated with enthusiastic babbling directed specifically at Alexander, as if she were providing detailed commentary on the banana's quality. "She is showing off for you," Maria observed, refilling Alexander's coffee cup with the careful attention that had become their morning ritual. "Usually she is not so performative with food." Alexander found himself smiling at Sophia's latest achievement, successfully grasping a piece of fruit only to immediately throw it on the floor with apparent glee. "She's very determined," he said, then added without thinking, "I admire that quality." The comment hung in the air with more weight than he had intended. Maria paused in her movements, studying his face with an expression that had become familiar over recent weeks. Part gratitude, part confusion, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Why do you spend so much time with us? I know you have very important work, very important people who need your attention, but every Tuesday and Friday you are here. Even weekends sometimes, when I come for special cleaning." The question was fair, and Alexander realized he had been expecting it. The honest answer, that Sophia and Maria had somehow become the most compelling part of his week, seemed both too simple and too complex to articulate properly. "I enjoy her company," he said finally, gesturing toward Sophia, who had begun attempting to eat her own fingers with the same enthusiasm she had shown the banana. "She's uncomplicated, Maria nodded slowly, though her expression suggested this explanation felt incomplete. In Brazil, we have a saying, Deus escreve certo por linhas tortas. God writes straight with crooked lines. Sometimes the most important things come to us in ways we do not expect. Before Alexander could respond to this observation, Sophia began making urgent sounds that clearly demanded his attention. She had discovered that dropping food from her high chair produced satisfying sounds when it hit the kitchen floor, and she wanted to share this revelation with him immediately. Her excitement was so genuine, so purely joyful, that Alexander found himself laughing. An actual laugh, not the polite sounds he produced during business social functions. The sound of his laughter seemed to delight Sophia even more. She clapped her hands together, food-sticky fingers creating small, slapping sounds that she clearly found hilarious. The moment felt suspended, perfect in its simplicity, until David Chen appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that suggested controlled emergency. "Sir, I apologize for interrupting, but Mrs. Morrison is on line 1. The announcement fell into their breakfast scene like a stone into still water. Alexander felt his entire body tense at the mention of his ex-wife, a reaction that didn't go unnoticed by Maria. Sophia, sensing the sudden shift in adult energy, stopped her food-dropping experiment and looked between the adults with concerned alertness. "Tell her I'll call back this afternoon," Alexander said, not moving from his chair. "Sir, she says it's urgent. Something about family matters that require immediate discussion." Alexander's jaw tightened. Patricia had perfected the art of creating urgency around conversations that typically involved either money or her desire to maintain social connections to his wealth and influence. Their divorce had been finalized 3 years earlier, but she continued to insert herself into his life with the persistence of someone who refused to accept that their marriage's end meant the end of her access to his resources. 5 minutes, he said finally, standing with obvious reluctance. Sophia immediately began fussing at his departure, reaching toward him with the demanding persistence that had become her signature response to his absence. Alexander paused, looking down at her distressed face. Without thinking, he reached out to touch her cheek gently. "I'll be right back," he told her seriously, as if she could understand both the words and the promise behind them. The phone call lasted exactly 7 minutes. Alexander had David time it, and consisted entirely of Patricia's assumption that he would underwrite her latest social venture, a charity auction that would primarily benefit her own social standing. He agreed to a modest donation with the efficient coldness that had characterized their interactions since the divorce, then returned to the kitchen to find Sophia crying with the heartbroken intensity of someone who had been personally betrayed. She stopped crying the moment she saw him, her face transforming from despair to radiant joy so quickly that Maria laughed despite herself. "She missed you," Maria said simply. "This is what she does when you leave. She waits and watches the door until you come back." The information hit Alexander with unexpected force. Sophia had developed separation anxiety specifically related to his departures. He was no longer just an amusing adult who appeared periodically. He had become someone she depended on for security and comfort. The responsibility felt enormous and terrifying and absolutely essential. "I'm sorry I left," he told Sophia seriously, settling back into his chair. She responded by throwing her arms up in obvious demand to be held, and Alexander complied without hesitation. With Sophia contentedly nestled against his shoulder, Alexander realized that Patricia's call, which would once have dominated his thoughts for hours, had already faded to irrelevance. The contrast felt significant. His ex-wife's problems seemed like echoes from a life that no longer fit properly, while the weight of Sophia in his arms felt like the most real thing he had experienced in years. "Mr. Morrison," Maria said quietly, "Sophia is becoming very attached to you. This is wonderful, but also, it makes me worry." "Why?" "Because attachment means expectations. and expectations can be broken. The warning carried undertones Alexander didn't want to examine too closely. He looked down at Sophia, who had begun making contented sounds against his shoulder, her small hand fisted in his shirt fabric with possessive certainty. "Some expectations," he said carefully, "are worth meeting." The pediatrician's office in Beverly Hills was designed to soothe anxious parents with its soft lighting and carefully curated artwork featuring smiling children and rainbow motifs. Alexander felt conspicuously out of place among the mothers in yoga attire and fathers checking work emails, yet he found himself unwilling to wait in the car as originally planned. Maria had mentioned Sophia's 9-month checkup casually, almost as an afterthought during their morning coffee ritual. Alexander had surprised them both by asking if he could accompany them. The request had hung in the air for several seconds before Maria nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely certain about his motivations. Now, watching Sophia charm the waiting room with her newfound ability to wave at strangers, Alexander wondered about his own motivations as well. He told himself it was simple concern for an employee's child, but the protective anxiety he felt as they waited for their appointment suggested something far more complicated. Sophia had achieved several new milestones in recent weeks, each one celebrated in Alexander's presence, as if he were a proud family member rather than her mother's employer. She could sit unsupported now, clap her hands on command, and had recently begun saying what sounded distinctly like "da-da" whenever she saw him approaching. Maria had laughed the first time it happened, explaining that babies often called all men "da-da," regardless of actual relationship, but Alexander found himself hoping Sophia's usage was more specific. "Santos, Sophia?" The nurse's voice cut through the waiting room chatter. Alexander stood automatically, then caught himself. He wasn't Sophia's parent or guardian. He had no medical authority here, no legitimate reason to accompany them beyond his own inexplicable attachment to this child's well-being. Maria noticed his hesitation and made a decision that surprised them both. "Would you like to come with us?" she asked quietly. "Sophia would like having you there." The examination room felt smaller with 3 adults and one increasingly fussy baby. Sophia had developed strong opinions about medical procedures since her emergency room visit and expressed those opinions with impressive vocal range. She calmed slightly when Alexander moved closer to the examination table, her small hand reaching for him with desperate persistence. "Dr. Williams, a woman in her 50s, with the efficient kindness of someone who had spent decades managing anxious parents and uncooperative children, glanced between Alexander and Maria with professional curiosity. "And you are?" she asked Alexander politely. "Alexander Morrison," he replied, then found himself struggling to define his relationship to Sophia. Friend seemed inadequate, family friend presumptuous, employer's representative completely wrong. "He is," Maria began, then paused, clearly facing the same definitional challenge. "He is very important to Sophia," she finished simply. Dr. Williams nodded, as if this explanation was perfectly adequate, and began her examination. Sophia tolerated the procedures better with Alexander present, reaching for him whenever the doctor's ministrations became particularly intrusive. When it came time for vaccinations, Sophia's distress was genuine and heartbreaking, but she sought comfort from Alexander with the instinctive certainty that he would provide it. "She has a strong attachment to you," Dr. Williams observed as Alexander held Sophia while she recovered from her shots. "This kind of bonding is usually reserved for primary caregivers." "Is that unusual?" Alexander asked, surprised by how much he wanted reassurance that Sophia's attachment was normal, healthy, worth nurturing. "Not unusual exactly, but noteworthy. Babies typically form their strongest bonds with people who provide consistent care and emotional availability." She paused, studying Alexander's interaction with Sophia, who had stopped crying and begun making contented sounds against his shoulder. "May I ask how long you've been part of Sophia's life?" "About 4 months," Alexander replied, then realized how inadequate that time frame sounded compared to the depth of connection he felt. 4 months of very regular contact," Maria added quietly. "Every Tuesday and Friday, sometimes weekends, he has been very present." Dr. Williams made notes on Sophia's chart, her expression thoughtful. "Babies form attachments based on consistency and emotional responsiveness, not just biological relationships. Sophia clearly sees you as a secure base, someone she can count on for comfort and protection." The clinical explanation felt both validating and terrifying. Alexander had somehow become essential to Sophia's sense of security without fully realizing the weight of that responsibility. Looking down at her trusting face, he felt the magnitude of commitment that fatherhood must entail. The knowledge that someone's well-being depended not just on your presence, but on your emotional availability, your consistency, your willingness to prioritize their needs above your own convenience. "Is that healthy for her?" Maria asked, voicing the concern that had been growing in Alexander's own mind. "This attachment to someone who is not family?" Dr. Williams considered the question carefully. "Attachment itself is always healthy for children. The risk comes if that attachment is suddenly severed or proves unreliable. As long as Mr. Morrison remains consistently present and emotionally available, this bond will benefit Sophia's development." The weight of expectations settled on Alexander's shoulders like a physical burden. Sophia's well-being now depended not just on Maria's excellent care, but on his continued involvement in her life. The responsibility felt enormous and absolutely essential simultaneously. After the appointment, they walked to Alexander's car in thoughtful silence. Sophia had fallen asleep in her car seat, exhausted by the morning's medical adventure. Alexander found himself studying her peaceful face, marveling at how someone so small could have reorganized his priorities so completely. "Mr. Morrison," Maria said as he started the engine, "I need to tell you something." The seriousness in her tone made Alexander's stomach clench with anxiety. "What is it?" "Sophia's father. He never wanted to be involved. When I was pregnant, he made it very clear that he wanted nothing to do with us." She paused, watching Sophia sleep. "I promised myself that I would never let Sophia depend on someone who might disappear, but watching her with you—" "I'm not going to disappear," Alexander said with more conviction than he had ever felt about any business decision. "How can you promise that? You have a whole life, important work, family obligations. We are not your responsibility." Alexander pulled into his driveway and turned to face Maria directly. Sophia stirred slightly in her sleep but didn't wake, her small hand curled into a fist beside her cheek. "You're right," he said quietly. "You're not my responsibility. But Sophia has become my choice. Every day she's my choice. That's different." Maria's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "Why?" she asked, echoing her question from the hospital weeks earlier. Alexander looked at Sophia's sleeping face and knew the answer with absolute certainty. "Because she makes me remember what it feels like to matter to someone, really matter, and I want to be worthy of that trust." The first sign of trouble came disguised as kindness. Alexander's older sister, Catherine, arrived unannounced on a Friday afternoon, her Bentley purring to a stop in the circular driveway, just as Maria was loading Sophia into her car to leave. Through his study window, Alexander watched Catherine emerge with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission, her tailored suit and practiced smile, the armor of Beverly Hills society warfare. He hadn't spoken to Catherine in 6 months. Not since their last argument about his reclusive tendencies and failure to maintain appropriate social connections. Now she stood in his foyer with the expression of someone who had discovered a fascinating new problem to solve. "Alexander, darling," she said, air-kissing his cheeks with perfunctory warmth. "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit. I was having lunch with Patricia, and she mentioned some concerns. The mention of his ex-wife's name immediately put Alexander on guard. Patricia and Catherine had maintained their friendship post-divorce, bonding over shared social circles, and their mutual conviction that Alexander needed constant management. Their combined attention typically meant trouble. "What kind of concerns?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew. Catherine settled into the living room with the practiced ease of someone claiming territory. "She says you've been behaving oddly. Cancelling important meetings, spending time in the kitchen with the help, developing some sort of attachment to your housekeeper's baby." The clinical way she delivered the last phrase made Alexander's jaw tighten. Sophia isn't just the housekeeper's baby. She's a remarkable child, and Maria is an exceptional employee. "Oh, darling." Catherine's smile carried the patronizing warmth reserved for relatives who had lost perspective. "Of course you care about your staff's well-being. That's very generous. But Patricia is worried you're becoming too invested. It's not appropriate." "Appropriate according to whom?" "According to reality, Alexander. You're a 58-year-old bachelor with no children of your own, becoming emotionally attached to an employee's infant. People will talk. They are talking. And after everything you've worked to build," Alexander found himself standing, his hands clenched into fists. "What exactly are people saying? That you've lost perspective, that you're having some kind of midlife crisis. Some are suggesting the attachment might be unhealthy. The implication hung in the air like poison gas." Alexander felt his face flush with anger he hadn't experienced since the divorce proceedings, when Patricia's attorneys had tried to paint him as emotionally unstable to improve her settlement prospects. "You're suggesting something inappropriate is happening?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Catherine said carefully. "But appearances matter, Alexander. A wealthy older man with an unusual interest in a young woman's baby raises questions. Questions that could damage your reputation, affect your business relationships, hurt the very people you think you're helping." The threat was delivered with surgical precision. Catherine had always possessed the ability to find pressure points and apply exactly the right amount of leverage to achieve her desired outcomes. She wasn't accusing him of wrongdoing. She was pointing out how easily accusation could be manufactured from innocent circumstances. "What do you want, Catherine?" "I want you to step back from this situation before it becomes a problem for everyone involved. Be generous with severance. Help the woman find other employment, but create some distance. For your own protection and theirs." Alexander moved to the window overlooking the garden, where Sophia often played during Maria's work hours. Even now he could picture her there, crawling through the grass with determined exploration, looking back frequently to ensure he was watching her discoveries. The thought of voluntarily severing that connection felt like contemplating amputation. "No," he said simply. "Alexander, be reasonable. You barely know this child. Yes, she's adorable. All babies are adorable. But she's not your family, not your responsibility. You have real obligations, real relationships that deserve your attention." "Such as?" Catherine's smile faltered slightly. "Such as the Morrison Foundation Board, which you've been neglecting. Such as maintaining the social connections that support your business interests. Such as finding an appropriate companion for this stage of your life, instead of playing house with the hired help." Each phrase felt like a calculated insult designed to reduce his relationship with Sophia and Maria to something tawdry or inappropriate. Alexander realized that Catherine wasn't just delivering social pressure. She was conducting reconnaissance, gathering information about the depth of his attachment to determine how much force would be required to break it. "My relationship with Sophia and Maria isn't playing house," he said quietly. "It's the most meaningful connection I've had with another human being in years. That's exactly what worries me, darling. You're projecting onto this situation because you're lonely. But the solution isn't adopting someone else's baby. It's building appropriate relationships with people from your own social sphere. Alexander turned from the window to face his sister directly. What if I don't want relationships from my social sphere? What if those relationships are hollow, transactional, and ultimately meaningless? Then you work to make them meaningful. You don't abandon your entire life for a fantasy about being someone's substitute father. The words hit harder than Catherine probably intended. Alexander felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger exactly, but a crystalline clarity about the forces aligning against the fragile happiness he had discovered. Is that what you think this is? A fantasy? I think it's a man approaching 60 who never had children of his own, attaching to the first baby who showed him affection. I think it's natural, understandable, and ultimately harmful to everyone involved if you don't address it responsibly. Catherine stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced efficiency. I've arranged for you to meet Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell next week. She specializes in transition counseling for men facing significant life changes. Very discreet, very professional. You've arranged therapy for me. I've arranged a consultation. Someone objective who can help you gain perspective on this situation before it becomes damaging. Alexander walked his sister to the door with mechanical politeness, accepting her cheek kiss and promising to consider her advice with no intention of following through. After her Bentley disappeared down the driveway, he stood in his foyer feeling like a man who had just received a declaration of war, disguised as family concern. The house felt different now. No longer a sanctuary where Sophia's laughter could transform empty rooms into something resembling home. Instead, it felt like a place under surveillance, where innocent moments would be scrutinized for evidence of inappropriate attachment or emotional instability. For the first time since meeting Sophia, Alexander wondered if loving her might actually be the most selfish thing he had ever done. The envelope arrived on Monday morning, hand-delivered by courier during the 15 minutes between Maria's arrival and their usual breakfast routine. Alexander recognized the letterhead immediately. Pemberton, Walsh and Associates, the legal firm that handled his family's most delicate matters. The same firm Catherine used when subtlety had proven insufficient. Inside, beneath language designed to sound routine and professional, lay a carefully constructed trap. The letter requested his presence at a meeting to discuss concerns regarding the welfare of a minor child currently residing periodically on your property. It mentioned anonymous reports and professional obligations to investigate situations that might compromise child safety. Alexander read the letter 3 times, his coffee growing cold as the implications crystallized. Someone had contacted social services. Someone had suggested that Sophia might be at risk in his household. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, presented as voluntary but carrying the implicit threat of formal investigation if he failed to attend. His hands were trembling as he folded the letter, fury and fear competing for dominance in his chest. Through the kitchen window, he could see Maria helping Sophia practice walking in the garden, the baby taking unsteady steps between the safety of her mother's hands and the garden bench. Sophia's delighted laughter drifted through the glass, a sound that had become synonymous with joy in Alexander's carefully ordered world. Now that joy felt fragile, threatened by forces he couldn't negotiate with or buy off. Legal proceedings followed different rules than business deals, rules designed to prioritize caution over relationship, suspicion over trust. "Mr. Morrison?" Maria's voice came from the kitchen doorway. "Is everything okay? You look upset." Alexander looked up at her concerned face and realized he was facing an impossible choice. He could tell Maria about the letter, warn her about what was coming, and watch her pack Sophia's things with the efficiency of someone who had learned to run from trouble. Or he could handle this quietly, protect them from knowledge that would only cause panic, and risk them being blindsided by official intervention. Just some business complications, he said, folding the letter and slipping it into his jacket pocket. Nothing that can't be managed. The lie felt necessary and terrible. Maria nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Sophia chose that moment to appear around the corner, moving with the determined crawling technique she had perfected, making straight for Alexander with the single-minded focus that characterized all her goals. She pulled herself up using his chair leg, then looked at him expectantly, arms raised in the universal demand to be held. Alexander lifted her automatically, and Sophia immediately began her morning ritual of examining his face with serious concentration, as if checking for any changes since their last encounter. "She missed you this weekend," Maria observed, settling into her own chair with coffee. "Every time someone came to the door, she would look toward it hopefully, then seem disappointed when it was not you." The information should have warmed him, but now it felt like evidence in a case being built against him. How would a social worker interpret a baby's attachment to a man with no biological connection to her? How would they explain Sophia's obvious preference for his company over that of most other adults? "I missed her too," Alexander admitted, then caught himself. Such statements could be twisted, taken out of context, used to support accusations of inappropriate attachment or unstable behavior. Sophia began making her conversational sounds, the complex babbling that seemed to carry real meaning, even though no one could translate it. She pointed at various objects around the kitchen, providing what appeared to be detailed commentary on their significance. Alexander found himself responding seriously to her observations, asking follow-up questions about her opinions on the fruit bowl and coffee machine. Maria watched these exchanges with the fond amusement that had become her standard response to their morning conversations. But today, Alexander found himself wondering how their interaction might appear to trained observers looking for signs of problematic behavior. Was it normal for a man his age to engage so seriously with a baby's nonsense chatter? Was his obvious delight in Sophia's company evidence of healthy affection or concerning obsession? "Mr. Morrison," Maria said quietly, "I want to ask you something, and I hope you will be honest with me." Alexander's entire body tensed. "Of course. Are you happy? With your life, I mean." "Before we came here, were you happy?" The question was unexpected and more penetrating than any business adversary had ever managed. Alexander realized that Maria was trying to understand his motivations, perhaps sensing the external pressure building around their unusual family arrangement. "No," he said honestly, "I was successful, respected, financially secure, but I wasn't happy. I didn't even remember what happiness felt like until Sophia, until both of you." Maria's smile was sad and knowing. In Brazil, we have another saying: "Felicidade compartilhada é felicidade dobrada." Shared happiness is doubled happiness. But we also say, "Nem tudo que reluz é ouro." Not everything that shines is gold. Before Alexander could ask what she meant by the warning, Sophia began fussing, reaching toward the garden with obvious desire to return to her interrupted play session. Maria stood to take her outside, but paused at the kitchen door. "Mr. Morrison, if someone told you that loving Sophia was bad for her, what would you do?" The question hit him like cold water. Why would anyone say that? Just hypothetically, if someone said your presence in her life was harmful, that she would be better off without your attention, what would you choose? Alexander looked at Sophia, who was watching him with the intense focus that suggested she sensed adult tension, even if she couldn't understand its source. The thought of voluntarily removing himself from her life felt like contemplating self-destruction, but the alternative, risking her welfare by fighting to stay, felt equally unbearable. "I would choose whatever was best for Sophia," he said finally, "even if it destroyed me." Maria nodded, as if this answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "That is how I know you really love her," she said quietly. Because you would sacrifice your own happiness for hers. After they went outside, Alexander sat alone in the kitchen with the legal letter burning in his pocket. Through the window, he watched Sophia take tentative steps across the lawn, her face radiant with accomplishment each time she managed more than 2 steps without falling. Maria shadowed her movements with protective vigilance, ready to catch her if she stumbled. The scene looked perfect, peaceful, exactly like the kind of environment any child should be fortunate to experience. But Alexander now understood how easily perfection could be reframed as problematic, how love could be redefined as obsession, how protection could be transformed into possession. By Thursday, he would have to defend the most important relationship of his life to people trained to find fault with unconventional arrangements. And he wasn't sure he knew how to do that without losing everything that mattered. The social services office on Wilshire Boulevard occupied a building that might have housed any number of professional services, accounting firms, insurance companies, places where people's lives were reduced to forms and filing systems. Alexander sat in the waiting area, surrounded by government-issued furniture and motivational posters, featuring diverse children smiling at cameras with staged spontaneity. Across from him sat Ms. Jennifer Rodriguez, the caseworker assigned to investigate the concerns regarding Sophia's welfare. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps 35, with the efficient kindness of someone who had learned to balance genuine care for children with bureaucratic necessity. Her questions had begun gently, but grown increasingly pointed as the interview progressed. "Mr. Morrison," she said, consulting her tablet with practiced efficiency, "help me understand the nature of your relationship with Sophia Santos. You're not related to her, not her legal guardian. Yet you've been present for medical appointments, spent considerable time with her during work hours, and according to our reports, she shows unusual attachment behaviors toward you." Alexander had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this conversation, yet every answer felt like stepping into quicksand. "Sophia is the daughter of my employee, Maria Santos. Over time, we've developed a friendship with a 10-month-old baby." The skepticism in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. Alexander realized that normal language was inadequate to describe something that existed outside conventional social categories. How could he explain that Sophia's trust had become the foundation of his emotional life without sounding unstable or inappropriate? "I spend time with Sophia because her presence brings me joy, and because I believe my presence brings her comfort. Her mother works in my home, and I've watched Sophia develop, celebrate her milestones, been present during her medical needs." "The emergency room visit in October?" "Yes. Maria called, and I felt it was important to be there." "Why?" The question was simple and devastating. Alexander found himself struggling to articulate something that felt as natural as breathing. "Because Sophia matters to me. Because when someone you care about is in distress, you want to help." Ms. Rodriguez made notes with the neutral expression of someone recording potentially significant information. "Mr. Morrison, I want to be clear that no one is questioning your intentions. But we need to evaluate whether this arrangement serves Sophia's best interests. How could my caring about Sophia not serve her best interests? Because attachment, while healthy, can become problematic when it creates dependency on unstable circumstances. You're a wealthy, unmarried man with no legal connection to this child. Your interest in her, however well-intentioned, could disappear tomorrow with no consequences for you and devastating effects on her emotional development." The analysis was clinical and accurate and completely failed to account for the way Sophia's laughter had reorganized his understanding of what mattered in life. Alexander realized that his strongest defense, the depth of his love for Sophia, was precisely what made him appear most dangerous to the system designed to protect her. "Ms. Rodriguez, what specifically concerns you about my relationship with Sophia?" Several things. First, the intensity of attachment on both sides appears unusual for the time frame involved. Second, you've begun making decisions typically reserved for parents or guardians, attending medical appointments, providing financial support for her care. Third, your employee may feel pressured to continue this arrangement due to the power dynamic in your employer-employee relationship. Each point felt like a scalpel, designed to dissect something beautiful and reveal its problematic anatomy. Alexander understood now why Maria had seemed increasingly anxious in recent weeks, why she sometimes watched him with expressions he couldn't decode. The power imbalance he had never considered was obvious to outside observers trained to identify exploitation. "Have you spoken with Maria about her feelings regarding this situation?" Alexander asked. "We have. Miss Santos expresses gratitude for your kindness and insists that Sophia's attachment to you is genuine and beneficial. However, she also admits to feeling concerned about the sustainability of the arrangement and the potential consequences if your interest in Sophia changes." Alexander felt something cold settle in his chest. Maria had been worried about exactly the scenarios this investigation was designed to prevent, yet had said nothing to him. She had watched him fall in love with her daughter, while simultaneously fearing the damage that love might eventually cause. What would you need to see to be convinced that this relationship is healthy for Sophia? Ms. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, studying Alexander with the measured assessment of someone making consequential decisions. "Honestly, I would need to see evidence that your involvement serves Sophia's needs rather than your own. That it provides stability rather than creating dependency. That it doesn't interfere with Maria's ability to make independent choices about her daughter's care. And if I can't provide that evidence, then I would recommend that you voluntarily reduce your involvement with Sophia to a more appropriate level. Generous severance for Maria, assistance finding new employment, but clear boundaries around your personal relationship with her daughter." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what was being proposed. The complete severing of his connection to Sophia presented as a reasonable solution to problems he had never recognized. Alexander realized that fighting this recommendation would likely trigger formal proceedings, legal challenges that would consume months and potentially expose Sophia to exactly the kind of instability the system was designed to prevent. "How much time do I have to make this decision?" 2 weeks. We'll schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss your plans for creating appropriate boundaries." Alexander left the building feeling like a man who had just received a terminal diagnosis. The Los Angeles afternoon felt too bright, too normal for someone whose world had just been systematically dismantled by well-intentioned professionals. He sat in his car for nearly 20 minutes, unwilling to drive home to a house where Sophia's absence would soon become permanent. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Sophia took 4 steps today. She was so proud. Wish you could have seen." The message was accompanied by a photo of Sophia standing triumphantly beside the coffee table, her face radiant with accomplishment. Alexander stared at the image until his eyes blurred, memorizing details he might need to sustain him through whatever came next. He had 2 weeks to figure out how to love someone enough to let them go, and he had no idea how to survive that particular form of self-destruction. The conversation happened in the garden, where Sophia had taken her first assisted steps, where she had discovered the joy of throwing leaves in the air and watching them fall like confetti. Alexander had chosen the location deliberately, hoping that being surrounded by memories of happiness might make the devastation he was about to cause somehow more bearable. Maria sat on the stone bench with Sophia in her lap, the baby contentedly examining a dandelion with the scientific focus she brought to all new discoveries. It was Tuesday morning, their usual time, but everything felt wrong. Alexander had barely slept in the 5 days since his meeting with social services, and Maria had clearly noticed his changed demeanor. Sophia has been asking for you, Maria said quietly, using the word asking to describe the way Sophia looked toward the kitchen door whenever she heard footsteps, the disappointed sounds she made when other people appeared instead of Alexander. Yesterday, she crawled to your study and sat outside the door for almost an hour. I think she was waiting for you. The image of Sophia waiting patiently for him to appear was almost unbearable. Alexander realized he had been avoiding the usual interactions, making excuses to work elsewhere in the house, unconsciously beginning the separation process before having the courage to make it official. Maria, I need to talk to you about something important. Something in his tone made her look up sharply. Sophia, sensing adult tension, stopped her examination of the dandelion and looked between them with worried eyes. Someone has expressed concerns about my relationship with Sophia, Alexander continued, each word feeling like swallowing glass. Professional concerns about whether my involvement in her life is appropriate. Maria's face went very still. What kind of concerns? Social services. They believe that Sophia's attachment to me might not be healthy for her long-term development, that my presence in her life creates complications. What complications? Maria's voice was carefully controlled, but Alexander could see fear building in her eyes. They worry about dependency, about what happens when someone like me, with no legal connection to Sophia, becomes essential to her emotional well-being and then isn't available anymore. Maria was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that Alexander knew she had been dreading. Sophia began fussing, reaching toward Alexander with the insistent demand that had become their established pattern. Without thinking, he moved closer and lifted her, and she immediately settled against his shoulder with contented sounds. They want you to stop seeing her, Maria said. It wasn't a question. They want me to establish appropriate boundaries, to step back to a more professional relationship with both of you. Professional. Maria repeated the word as if it tasted bitter. After months of you being the most important person in her life besides me, after she calls you Dada and looks for you every morning and cries when you leave. Alexander felt Sophia's small hand fisting in his shirt. Her unconscious claim of possession that had become so familiar, he barely noticed it anymore. Now it felt like a weight he would carry forever, the knowledge of what he was about to lose, what he was choosing to destroy. I don't want this, Maria. But I can't be responsible for harming Sophia's development. If my presence in her life is creating problems, who says it's creating problems? Maria stood abruptly, her voice rising for the first time since Alexander had known her. Some stranger who spent 1 hour asking questions? Someone who doesn't know how Sophia lights up when she sees you, who doesn't understand that you've been the most stable, loving presence she's ever known besides me. Sophia began crying, startled by her mother's angry tone and the adult tension surrounding her. Alexander instinctively began the gentle, swaying motion that usually calmed her. But even his comfort couldn't completely soothe distress that seemed to emanate from the air itself. Maria, I love Sophia. More than I thought possible, but what if they're right? What if I'm being selfish, holding on to something that makes me happy without considering the long-term consequences for her? Do you want to know what I think? Maria's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I think someone saw a rich man who was too happy, too content with something simple and pure, and decided it was wrong. I think someone who has never felt real love looked at what you and Sophia have and decided it must be unhealthy because it doesn't fit their rules. The accusation hung between them. Alexander realized that Maria was probably right, that his connection to Sophia threatened people's assumptions about appropriate relationships, about the boundaries that should exist between different social classes, about the kinds of love that were permissible for men his age. But what if they're right about the dependency issue? Alexander asked, hating himself for voicing the doubt that had been consuming him. What if Sophia becoming so attached to me is unfair to her? Maria was quiet for several minutes, watching Alexander hold her daughter, observing the way Sophia had completely relaxed against him, despite the emotional storm surrounding them. "Can I tell you something?" she said finally. "Sophia's father, when I told him I was pregnant, he said I was trying to trap him. He said the baby wasn't his responsibility, that I was trying to create artificial connections to manipulate him." Alexander felt his chest tighten with anger at this unknown man who had abandoned Maria and Sophia. "But you," Maria continued, "you never had to care about us. You chose to. Every day you choose to be present, to be kind, to love her without any obligation or benefit to yourself. That's not dependency, Mr. Morrison. That's family." Sophia had fallen asleep in Alexander's arms, exhausted by the emotional upheaval. Looking down at her peaceful face, Alexander realized that the social worker's clinical analysis had missed the most important factor. Sophia wasn't damaged by his love. She was flourishing because of it. But understanding this truth didn't solve the problem they faced. The system designed to protect Sophia couldn't distinguish between harmful attachment and healthy love, couldn't account for bonds that formed outside conventional family structures. "What do we do?" Alexander asked quietly. Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "We have 2 weeks?" "Yes. Then we have 2 weeks to figure out how to protect our family." Alexander realized they were no longer just fighting for his right to love Sophia. They were fighting for their right to exist as the unconventional but genuine family they had somehow become. But he had no idea how to win a battle against a system that saw their love as a problem requiring correction. The solution came from the most unexpected source: David Chen, Alexander's meticulously professional assistant, who had watched his employer's transformation with growing concern and, finally, understanding. Because that's what we are now, whether the official people understand it or not. The word family settled over them like a benediction and a declaration of war. He appeared in Alexander's study 3 days before the scheduled follow-up meeting with social services, carrying a manila folder thick with documents and wearing the expression of someone who had made a decision that could cost him his career. "Sir," David said, closing the door behind him with unusual formality, "I need to speak with you about the investigation into your relationship with Sophia Santos." Alexander looked up from quarterly reports he had been pretending to review. "What about it?" "I know about the social services meeting. I know about the pressure from your sister and ex-wife to end your involvement with the child. And I know you're considering compliance to protect Sophia from further scrutiny." The knowledge in David's voice suggested this conversation had been building for weeks. Alexander realized his assistant had been conducting his own investigation, watching the forces aligning against something David had come to understand was precious. "Yes, I'm considering it. The alternative might be worse for Sophia." David placed the folder on Alexander's desk with careful precision. "Before you make that decision, you should know what I've discovered about who initiated the social services complaint." Alexander felt his stomach clench. "Who?" "Your sister Catherine, with support from Patricia. They coordinated the complaint as what they call an intervention to force you back to what they consider appropriate behavior and social connections. The betrayal felt like physical impact." Alexander had suspected external pressure, but hadn't imagined his own family would weaponize child welfare services against the relationship that had become the center of his emotional life. "How do you know this?" "Because they asked me to provide documentation of your obsessive behaviors regarding Sophia. Times you cancelled meetings, instances where you prioritized time with her over business obligations, evidence that you were becoming emotionally unstable." David's voice carried the careful neutrality he used when delivering particularly sensitive information. But Alexander could detect underlying anger at being asked to betray someone he had served loyally for 15 years. "And did you provide that documentation?" I told them I would consider their request. Instead, I did something else. David opened the folder and spread its contents across the desk. Birth certificates, hospital records, adoption papers, legal documents that Alexander couldn't immediately process, but that David had clearly organized with his characteristic attention to detail. I investigated Sophia's background, her birth parents, the circumstances that led to Maria's guardianship, the legal status of their current arrangement. Alexander studied the papers with growing confusion. What did you find? Sophia's biological parents were James and Rebecca Chen. Yes, my distant relatives, which is how I was able to access family records. They died in a car accident when Sophia was 3 months old. Maria Santos wasn't just their housekeeper. She was named as Sophia's guardian in their will, specifically because of her exceptional care for the child and their trust in her judgment. The information felt like puzzle pieces clicking into place. Alexander began to understand why Sophia had seemed familiar, why her presence had triggered responses he couldn't explain, why their connection had felt deeper than simple affection. There's more, David continued. James Chen had been searching for his biological family before the accident. He was adopted as an infant, and his records show his birth father was someone named Alexander Chen Morrison, your great-uncle, who died in Korea in 1953. Alexander's hands trembled as he processed the genealogy David had painstakingly reconstructed. Sophia wasn't a random child who had captured his attention. She was his family, connected to him through bloodlines that neither of them had known existed. Sophia is my great-great-niece. Technically, yes. More importantly, under California family law, you have legal standing to petition for guardianship, especially given that you've been providing substantial care and support for nearly a year. David pulled out additional documents, legal briefs, precedent cases, a petition already prepared for filing. Maria's guardianship was temporary, contingent on finding suitable permanent arrangements. She's been caring for Sophia while searching for the right situation. The social worker's concern about unstable circumstances actually supports your case. Sophia needs permanent family placement, and you're her closest living relative. Alexander felt the world reorganizing itself around this new information. The mysterious connection he had felt to Sophia, the immediate bond that had seemed inexplicable, suddenly made perfect sense. They had recognized each other across the genetic distance that neither had understood. Does Maria know about this? She knows about the family connection. She's the one who helped me trace the genealogy. She's been waiting for you to discover what she suspected months ago. Alexander thought about Maria's comment about old souls recognizing each other. Her observation that Sophia's attachment to him was unusual but meaningful. She had been protecting a secret that would have changed everything, waiting for him to understand what she had pieced together through careful observation and maternal instinct. Why didn't she tell me? Because she wanted to be certain you loved Sophia for who she is, not because of family obligation. She needed to know your commitment was authentic before revealing information that might change your motivations. Alexander stared at the document spread across his desk, legal proof of connections that had felt real from the first moment Sophia had smiled at him. The social worker's concerns about inappropriate attachment suddenly seemed absurd. He had been bonding with his own family member, responding to genetic familiarity that neither of them had consciously recognized. David, why did you do this research? Why did you help us when Catherine and Patricia asked you to do the opposite? David's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing something personal beneath his usual efficiency. Because in 15 years of working for you, I've never seen you as happy as you've been with Sophia and Maria, and because family matters more than social expectations, even when the family doesn't follow traditional patterns. Alexander realized that David had been making choices of his own, choosing loyalty and love over the easier path of compliance with family pressure. His assistant had become an unlikely ally in protecting something that couldn't be defended through conventional means. What happens now? Now you decide whether to file for legal guardianship and make this permanent, or continue letting other people define what your family should look like. Alexander looked at the legal documents that would formalize what his heart had already known for months. Sophia wasn't just a child he had grown to love. She was his family, his responsibility, his future. And Maria wasn't just an employee who had brought unexpected joy into his life. She was the woman who had protected his great-great-niece and guided him toward understanding what really mattered. For the first time in weeks, Alexander felt hope replacing fear. They weren't fighting for the right to love inappropriately. They were fighting for the right to be the family they had always been, just without knowing it. "Prepare the papers," he said quietly. "It's time to make this official." The follow-up meeting with social services took place in the same sterile office, but everything had changed. Alexander sat across from Ms. Rodriguez with David beside him, legal documents neatly organized in folders that would transform a problematic situation into a family reunification case. Maria held Sophia in the chair next to Alexander, the baby contentedly playing with a set of wooden blocks that made satisfying clicking sounds when struck together. Ms. Rodriguez reviewed the genealogical documentation with the careful attention of someone whose recommendations could alter lives. Birth certificates, death records, adoption papers, and DNA test results that confirmed what everyone in the room already knew. Sophia and Alexander were family, connected by blood ties that explained their immediate and profound connection. "This changes things significantly," Ms. Rodriguez admitted, looking up from the papers with an expression that mixed professional relief with personal surprise. "Our concerns about unstable attachment were based on the assumption that you had no familial connection to Sophia. Learning that you're her closest living relative recontextualizes everything we observed." Alexander felt vindication and anger in equal measure. The same behaviors that had seemed problematic when performed by a stranger were suddenly appropriate when performed by family. Sophia's preference for his company, his attendance at medical appointments, his emotional investment in her welfare, all of it transformed from concerning to commendable, based solely on genetic connection. "So the investigation is closed?" Maria asked quietly, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to trust official pronouncements until they proved durable. "More than closed, based on Sophia's needs for permanent family placement and Mr. Morrison's established relationship with her, I'm prepared to recommend formal guardianship proceedings. This is actually an ideal outcome for Sophia's long-term stability." Sophia chose that moment to accomplish something that had been building for weeks. She pulled herself into a standing position using Alexander's knee, then took 3 unsteady steps toward Maria before sitting down with obvious pride in her achievement. The adults watched this milestone moment with the shared wonder that accompanied witnessing a child's development. But Alexander felt additional significance in Sophia's journey, from his support to her mother's arms. "She's been practicing that all week," Maria said, lifting Sophia with maternal pride. "Every morning she stands by your chair and looks at me like she's planning something important." Ms. Rodriguez made notes about Sophia's obvious comfort with both adults, her secure attachment patterns, and the healthy family dynamic that had been developing organically over months of consistent care. What had once been evidence of problematic dependency now served as proof of successful bonding within an extended family structure. "Mr. Morrison, I do have some questions about your sister and ex-wife's concerns. They specifically mentioned worries about your emotional stability and the appropriateness of your attachment to Sophia." Alexander exchanged glances with David, who had prepared him for this line of inquiry. "I believe their concerns stemmed from misunderstanding the nature of my relationship with Sophia and Maria. They saw my changed priorities and emotional investment as signs of instability rather than evidence of family connection. And how do you feel about their intervention in this matter? The question felt like an invitation to express anger that Alexander had been controlling for days. Catherine and Patricia had weaponized child welfare services because they disapproved of his happiness, attempting to destroy the most meaningful relationship of his life to force him back into their preferred social patterns. I'm disappointed that family members would try to separate me from Sophia rather than trying to understand why she had become important to me. But I'm grateful their actions led to discovering our blood relationship. Without their complaint, we might never have known Sophia was family. It was a diplomatic response that concealed the depth of betrayal Alexander felt. But Ms. Rodriguez seemed to understand the subtext. She had probably seen other cases where family members used official channels to settle personal disputes. One final question. Maria, how do you feel about the possibility of sharing Sophia's guardianship with Mr. Morrison? This would be a significant change in your family structure. Maria was quiet for several moments, watching Sophia explore the wooden blocks with determined concentration. When she spoke, her voice carried certainty that surprised Alexander with its completeness. Mr. Morrison has been Sophia's family since before we knew they were related by blood. He has loved her, protected her, prioritized her welfare above his own convenience. If anything makes this official, it only confirms what has been true for months. She paused, then added something that made Alexander's throat tighten with emotion. Sophia deserves to grow up knowing she is loved by many people, not just me. She deserves to have family who choose her every day, who celebrate her milestones, who worry about her future. Mr. Morrison has already been doing all of these things. Making it legal just makes it permanent. Ms. Rodriguez closed her folder with the definitive sound of completed business. I'll recommend immediate approval for joint guardianship proceedings. Given Sophia's age and the established relationships, this should be a straightforward legal process. Outside the building, Alexander felt the California sunshine differently than he had in weeks. The legal weight that had been pressing on his chest was gone, replaced by anticipation for a future that no longer felt threatened by external forces determined to separate his family. Sophia babbled contentedly in her car seat, directing animated commentary toward Alexander as if she were providing detailed feedback on the morning's proceedings. He found himself responding seriously to her observations, asking follow-up questions about her opinions on social workers and legal documentation. She approves, Maria said, watching their interaction with the fond amusement that had become her default response to their conversations. I think she always knew you belonged to each other. As Alexander drove his family home, and the word family felt both new and absolutely accurate, he realized that loving Sophia had taught him something essential about the difference between obligation and choice. Blood might have connected them, but love had made them family. And while others might never understand the unconventional path that had brought them together, what mattered was that they had found each other when they all needed it most. The mansion that had once felt like a museum of his achievements now felt like a house where a family lived, where a baby's laughter could transform expensive rooms into places where real life happened. And for the first time in decades, Alexander Morrison felt like he was exactly where he belonged. 6 months later, the morning routine had evolved into something that bore little resemblance to Alexander's previous life, but felt more natural than anything he had ever known. Sophia, now walking with the determined independence of a 15-month-old, made her daily inspection tour of the kitchen, while Maria prepared coffee and Alexander reviewed reports that somehow seemed less urgent than they once had. The legal guardianship had been finalized without complication, transforming Alexander from employer to co-parent in the eyes of the law, and more importantly, in the daily reality of their shared life. Sophia now called him Papa Alex, with the casual authority of someone who had never questioned his permanent place in her world, while continuing to reserve Mama exclusively for Maria with fierce maternal loyalty. The house itself had undergone subtle but significant changes. Child safety locks appeared on cabinets. Colorful toys found permanent homes in previously pristine rooms, and the sound of Sophia's laughter had become such a constant that Alexander sometimes forgot how quiet the mansion had once been. Business associates who visited now encountered evidence of family life that would have been inconceivable in his previous existence. "Papa Alex," Sophia announced this morning, toddling toward him with the wooden blocks that had become her favorite communication tool. She had recently discovered that different objects made different sounds when dropped, and she was conducting extensive research into acoustic properties with the focused determination of a tiny scientist. "Good morning, Sophia," Alexander replied seriously, setting aside quarterly projections to give her his full attention. This exchange had become sacred time, their daily conversation that started each day with connection rather than obligation. Sophia climbed onto his lap with the confident expectation that she would be welcomed. Then began her morning ritual of examining his face with careful attention, as if checking for any changes since their last encounter. Satisfied with her inspection, she settled against his chest and began providing detailed commentary on the kitchen's contents in her private language that Alexander had learned to interpret with remarkable accuracy. "She's telling you about the new discovery yesterday," Maria translated, refilling Alexander's coffee with the easy intimacy that had replaced their former employer-employee formality. She figured out how to open the cabinet with the measuring cups. "Very proud of this achievement. Impressive engineering," Alexander told Sophia seriously, "though perhaps we should discuss consulting with adults before conducting cabinet experiments." Sophia responded with delighted giggles that suggested she had no intention of limiting her exploratory activities, but appreciated his feedback nonetheless. Their morning conversations had become increasingly sophisticated as her language development accelerated, with Alexander finding himself consulting child development books with the same intensity he once applied to market analysis. The business world had adapted to his changed priorities with surprising flexibility. Board meetings were scheduled around Sophia's nap times. Important calls were rescheduled if they conflicted with medical appointments, and Alexander's assistant had become expert at explaining that urgent matters might need to wait if they arose during family time. His colleagues had initially been puzzled by these new boundaries, but his continued business success, combined with obvious personal happiness, had gradually converted skepticism into acceptance. Catherine had eventually attempted reconciliation through carefully worded letters, expressing regret for misunderstanding his situation with Sophia. Alexander had responded politely but distantly, establishing boundaries that protected his family from future interference while maintaining minimal social courtesy. Patricia's invitations to various social functions continued arriving, but were declined with increasing frequency, as Alexander discovered how little he missed the superficial connections that had once filled his calendar. David Chen had been promoted to partner in the firm, a recognition of loyalty that went far beyond professional competence. His research into Sophia's family history had saved them all from devastating separation, and his willingness to prioritize human connection over social expectations had earned him Alexander's permanent gratitude and trust. "Papa Alex," Sophia said more clearly than usual, pointing toward the garden where she had recently learned to navigate the stone pathways with increasing confidence. "Outside?" "After breakfast," Alexander negotiated, understanding that Sophia's concept of time remained flexible, but that routine provided security she had learned to depend on. First food, then exploration. Maria watched this exchange with the affectionate observation that had replaced her earlier worry about the sustainability of their arrangement. The legal guardianship had eliminated uncertainty about Alexander's permanent commitment to Sophia, allowing their relationship to develop without the shadow of potential separation that had once made every interaction precious and fragile. "I have news," Maria announced as she settled into her own chair with coffee. "Dr. Williams called yesterday. Sophia's development assessment shows she's exceeding expectations in social and emotional growth. Above average in language development, excellent attachment patterns, very secure in her relationships." Alexander felt pride swell in his chest, not just for Sophia's achievements, but for their success in creating an environment where she could flourish. The professional validation mattered less than his daily observation of Sophia's confidence, her curiosity, her obvious security in knowing she was loved unconditionally by multiple adults who had chosen to prioritize her well-being. She also asked if we wanted to participate in a research study about non-traditional family structures, Maria continued. "Apparently, our situation is interesting to people who study child development in extended family arrangements." Alexander considered the idea of their family becoming a case study in successful, unconventional parenting. 6 months ago, the suggestion would have felt intrusive, a reminder of how their relationship had been scrutinized and questioned. Now it felt like an opportunity to demonstrate that love and commitment mattered more than conventional family structures. "What do you think?" he asked Maria, recognizing that major decisions affecting Sophia required consultation between her co-parents. "I think we might help other families who don't fit traditional patterns," Maria replied. "Show that there are many ways to create stable, loving homes for children." Sophia had finished her breakfast and begun the complex process of disassembling her wooden blocks to examine their internal construction. Her focused concentration reminded Alexander of himself during challenging negotiations, though her current project involved more giggling and fewer spreadsheets. Looking at this child who had transformed his understanding of purpose, Alexander realized that the empty spaces in his life hadn't been filled, they had been revealed as illusions. He had never been missing anything. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to discover what he was meant to protect, nurture, and love without condition. The morning sun streaming through the kitchen windows illuminated Sophia's absorbed exploration, Maria's contented observation, and Alexander's quiet wonder at finding himself exactly where he belonged, surrounded by family he had chosen and who had chosen him in return. 2 years had passed since that first morning when Sophia's crying had stopped at the sight of Alexander's face, and the transformation felt both complete and continuously unfolding. Sophia, now 3 years old, possessed the confident vocabulary of a child who had grown up surrounded by adults who listened seriously to her observations and responded to her questions with the respect typically reserved for important business associates. On this particular Tuesday morning, she sat at what everyone now called her place at the breakfast table, carefully arranging pieces of banana in patterns that apparently held deep significance. Her concentration was absolute, her small brow furrowed with the same intensity Alexander brought to complex negotiations, though Sophia's current project involved artistic fruit arrangement rather than corporate strategy. "Papa Alex," she said, without looking up from her banana architecture, "today is important day." "Why is today important?" Alexander asked, setting aside the morning reports that had somehow become secondary to Sophia's daily philosophical observations. "Because yesterday I was 2 and almost 3, but today I am 3 and almost 4. This is very different." Maria laughed from her position at the coffee maker, where she prepared the Brazilian blend that had become essential to their morning ritual. "She has been explaining this mathematical concept to me since she woke up," she said. "Very serious about the progression of time." Alexander nodded gravely at Sophia's analysis. "You're absolutely right. Being 3 and almost 4 requires different responsibilities than 2 and almost 3. Sophia looked up from her banana pattern with bright eyes. "What responsibilities?" "Well," Alexander considered seriously, 3 and almost 4-year-olds are old enough to help choose which books we read before bed. And they can help Papa Alex with very important decisions about garden flowers and kitchen organization." Sophia's face lit with the satisfaction of someone whose competence had been officially recognized. She had recently developed strong opinions about household management and regularly provided detailed feedback on everything from furniture arrangement to menu planning. Her suggestions were surprisingly practical, though they typically involved incorporating more opportunities for climbing, hiding, and investigating interesting objects. "Also," Sophia continued, returning to her banana construction, 3 and almost 4-year-olds can remember important things better, like how Mama makes perfect coffee and how Papa Alex always sits in the chair by the window so I can see him while I play." The observation was casual but profound, evidence of how deeply Sophia had absorbed the rhythms and patterns that made their household feel secure. Alexander realized that she had been studying them just as intensely as they had been learning to understand her needs, developing her own map of the emotional geography that defined their family. The morning proceeded with their established routine. Sophia's inspection tour of the garden, during which she provided detailed commentary on plant growth and weather conditions. Story time in the library, where she had recently begun attempting to read simple words aloud. And the planning session for their afternoon activities, which Sophia approached with the seriousness of a project manager coordinating multiple departments. "Today, we should visit the park," Sophia announced after careful consideration. "The swings need testing for safety, and the ducks require consulting about breed preferences." "Excellent priorities," Alexander agreed. "Safety inspections and duck consultation are very important work." Maria watched these exchanges with the deep contentment of someone whose greatest fears had been transformed into unexpected blessings. The worried mother who had once carried her daughter to work out of necessity had become the co-parent of a secure, confident child who expected the world to be a place where she was valued, protected, and taken seriously. The business world had long since adapted to Alexander's transformed priorities. Board meetings accommodated Sophia's schedule. Business trips were planned around her needs, and colleagues had learned that urgent matters might need to wait if they conflicted with family commitments. Far from damaging his professional reputation, Alexander's obvious happiness and clarity of purpose had enhanced his effectiveness in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. "Papa Alex," Sophia said during their afternoon garden consultation, "why did you live in this big house all by yourself before we came?" The question came with the directness that characterized all of Sophia's inquiries into adult behavior. She had recently become fascinated with the concept of "before we came," trying to understand how the adults in her life had managed to exist without her presence and guidance. Alexander considered how to explain the concept of loneliness to someone who had never experienced it, who had grown up surrounded by adults who competed for the privilege of listening to her thoughts and celebrating her discoveries. "I didn't know I was waiting for you and Mama," he said finally. "I thought I was happy, but I didn't understand what happiness really felt like until you taught me." Sophia nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "Like when I thought I liked regular cereal, but then I discovered cereal with bananas." "Exactly like that," Alexander agreed. "Sometimes you don't know something better exists until you find it." As the sun began to set over the garden, where Sophia had taken her first steps, where she had discovered the joy of throwing leaves and the satisfaction of successful climbing expeditions, Alexander reflected on the man he had been 2 years earlier. That Alexander Morrison had been successful by every conventional measure, but had lived in a world diminished by his own limitations. His inability to recognize what he was missing, his assumption that professional achievement was sufficient for a meaningful life. Now, watching Sophia demonstrate her latest climbing technique while providing detailed instruction to an audience of stuffed animals, Alexander understood that his previous existence hadn't been preparation for anything. It had simply been waiting for the moment when a crying baby would stop crying at the sight of his face and teach him that love wasn't something you earned or deserved, but something you chose to give and receive every day. Maria joined him on the garden bench as Sophia continued her climbing demonstration. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up the life you had before?" Alexander considered the question seriously, though he already knew the answer with absolute certainty. The life he had before, the empty mansion, the superficial relationships, the achievements that felt hollow, hadn't been given up so much as revealed as insufficient. He hadn't sacrificed anything real. He had simply stopped pretending that wealth and status could substitute for genuine connection. "I regret that it took me 58 years to discover what I was supposed to be doing with my life," he said finally. "But I don't regret a single day since Sophia taught me the difference between being successful and being essential." As twilight settled over their garden, Sophia finished her climbing exhibition and settled between her parents with the satisfaction of someone whose day had been well spent. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new questions, new opportunities to demonstrate her growing competence in navigating a world that had been designed specifically to support her flourishing. Alexander Morrison had built an empire of financial success, but his greatest achievement was learning to be chosen every day by a small person who had taught him that the most important victories were measured not in profit margins, but in trust, laughter, and the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he belonged.